chapter for today, I'm going to introduce will be the web authentication. So for the web authentication, we're going to show you how to configure for the web authentication functions to authenticate all your internal users to access to internet, and also the Active Directory linkage, how to authenticate the users from AD, and also do the SSO control. First of all is the web authentication. So for web authentication, first of all, you need to have the AA server. All the users need to be stored in the AA server. So AA server, we support local AA server, which is the server we created in the device as a local, and all users will be stored at the firewall device. And we also support the third-party AA server, which including Active Directory, LDAP, Reduce, and Takas Plus. And after you configure the web authentication, so all the access will be redirected to a web authentication page. The user must input correct username and password and get authorized to access to any of the internet resources. So which we use to identify and authenticate for the users. Here is the configuration for the web authentication. So under the network web auth, there's a web auth configuration page. First of all, you need to enable the web authentication. And for web authentication, you have two triggering for either HTTP or HTTPS traffic. And then for the interface, by default, we disable the authentication service by default for all the interfaces. If you want to enable the authentication for the specific interface, you can enable the web authentication at the specific interface. But by default, we will disable all the authentication service for all interface. And if you want to enable the web authentication for the specific interface, you can go to the interface configuration mode, and under the interface, there is a web auth option. You can enable the authentication service. And also enable the proactive web auth for your internal users. Proactive web auth. For the authentication in the firewall, actually we support for two scenarios. One we called proactive. So if you want to use the proactive authentication, you need to enable the proactive web auth at the specific interface, And after you configure the web authentication for the specific interface, so all the users that the traffic pass through this specific interface, the user needs to input for both IP address and port of the interface into the web browser to access to the authentication page, and then input the valid username and password to pass the authentication. So that is proactive. Another is passive. So passive authentication is a global authentication. So after you enable the passive authentication, so that means all the web access will be redirected automatically to the web authentication login page, which we already showed before. There's a web authentication page. You need to input for both username and password to get authorized. And in this case, you need to add the specific policy. So first of all, you need to have the user account created for the web authentication. Take take the local server as an example. So you can create the user in the firewall device. For example, we create user one, and then you add this user into the local AA server. And for the proactive mode, as I mentioned, if you enable the proactive authentication in the specific interface, you need to add the specific policy to control based on the users, which kind of service you want to control for the specific user. So for this proactive mode, so the user needs to manually input the interface IP plus with the authentication port to access to the web authentication page. But for passive mode, because we don't know which user need to be authenticated, because this is the global policy, so we need to add unknown role for all the users. So that means we will do the web authentication for all the users. And after the authentication, we can also perform the fine-grained control by adding the fine-grained policy. And also in the passive web authentication mode, because all the access need to be redirected to the web authentication login page, we also need to permit the DNS service at first. Otherwise, we are not able to be redirected to the login page. Okay, so in this case, for the passive mode, we need to add at least three policies. So first of all, we permit the DNS service. So in this case, all the access will be successfully redirected to the web authentication page. And secondly, we need to add a web authentication policy to authenticate for all unknown users. And the action will be web auth. The action, as I mentioned, policy has one action named web auth. So the policy will be web auth. And after the user passed the web authentication, we can also add a fine-grained control policy to control for the specific user. For example, I control for user 1, user 2 can access to all the service, or I can also change the service to HTTP or HTTPS, or also change for specific applications. So that is the fine-grained control for passive web authentication. And another one is the Active Directory. So we can synchronize with the AD server. This is the basic structure for the AD, which all the domain users stored. Okay, so in this case, we can configure the synchronization with AD server to synchronize all the users. Here's the configuration. So you need to input the IP address of the AD server, okay, the port of the AD server, and also base DN. Base DN is the unit that all the users stored. Okay, for example, training.houstonnet.com. And also login DN. Login DN is the default admin. Where is the default admin users stored? Okay. And through this, we can synchronize the users from AD server. In this case, after the synchronization with the third-party AD server, we can support the single sign-on. Okay, so this is the supported AD server to do the SSO. So we make sure all the users already added to the AD domain, and we can synchronize all the users' information to firewall. And regarding the Sso Solutions, we are offering 3 options. So one is we call Sso Monitor, which will monitor all the user status, but all the user status from the AD. And second one will be the AD scripting, which we need to install. We need to install an agent, an SSO agent at the AD server, And the third one will be the AD pooling function, which is the agentless solution. So all the users will still stored in the AD server. We keep synchronize the user information and also monitor the status for logging and logout. So this is the AD polling functions. It's also one of the commonly used solution without any agent install. Some questions for the web authentication. Which types of the AA server support web authentication? So as I mentioned, we support local and third party, like AD, reduced typecast bus, etc. So which types of the protocol traffics can be authenticated by the web authentication functions? So we support for both HTTP and HTTPS. And the supported SSO solutions, as I mentioned, we support to use the SSO monitor, the script, the polling functions. So those are the web authentication and also the AD SSO functions.